Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to give you a quick cheat sheet on classes. There's going to be a lot more lectures that I'm going to be doing regarding classes, but I'm just going to have this one be a quick intro video. I'm going to make my font size a little bit bigger. So classes. So when you create a class in C++, you're basically encapsulating the attributes and behavior of an object. Object, of course, in this case, we're dealing with person, place, or thing. Nouns, I guess. So any kind of items that we want to represent, instead of doing it by functions, in object-oriented programming, the benefits of object-oriented programming is being able to do it via classes. So having classes is kind of one step above using functions. And what it does, allows us to encapsulate all of the attributes and all of the behaviors regarding a particular item in one place. So it allows us to kind of make coding easier, and also allows us to maintain our code, allows us to actually divide up our code to a team to work on, and allows us to reuse our code as well. So there's a lot of, there's also information hiding that we can do as well. So there's a lot of benefits to using classes. So I'm going to start out with first the syntax and also the file management regarding a class. Usually classes comprise of several files. So when you start up your Visual Studio project and you're using a class, you usually end up with several files. So you usually have a header class, and then the source file of that class. And then you actually test out your class to see if your class actually works. And you usually do that with int main. And I usually call the file that contains my int main main. So you usually end up, when you do introduce classes to a project, you usually end up with 3 files. And then the more classes you have, the more files you're going to have. So in this case, let's assume we have 1 class to use. And in this case, you're going to end up with 3 files. So the header file for that class, the source file for that class, and then int main, where we actually make use of the class. So what is a class? A class is a blueprint of an object. So the class basically allows us to see what is made up, what this object is made up of. So let me give you an example. So let's say we have a class called person. Obviously there's a lot of things that make up a person, but for this example, I'm going to do something very simple. So here's the basic syntax for creating the header file of a class. So this, let me label this as the header. This is a header file. Usually the class name wouldn't be called class, so let me change that. So this class is called person, so I'm going to name this header file person. Right. So this is a header file. The syntax is usually like this. You have the keyword class, followed by the name you give the class. The name is up to you, whatever you want to name, depending on what object you're creating, right? So in our case, it's called person. You can name it whatever you want, but there are rules. The same rules applying to naming variables apply here. So in other words, you cannot start with a number, you can't have spaces, you know, and you can't have special characters. Then you open the brace. You close the brace, and you'll notice there's a semicolon involved at the end. Okay, so if you forget the semicolon, you will get errors. There are different accessor specifiers in the class. There are 3, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to 2 at first, and we're going to go into the other third one later on. Accessor specifiers, the 2 that I'm going to introduce today, is public and private. If anything you put under the public header here, these are referred to as accessor specifiers. So let me anything you put under public, that means can be accessed outside of this class. Anything you put under private can be accessed only within this class. So let me go ahead and do that. Okay. Now, under the private header is usually where we list our attributes. which are basically our variables. Under the public headings, usually where we list our behavior for that object, which are usually our functions. So let's just list some attributes and functions that comes with a person, I guess. So attributes, a person might have obviously a name. They will have a first name, they will have a last name, they will have age, they will have a date of birth. Those are attributes. Public functions. Now usually when you have attributes, you need to be able to set those attributes. So under public, you probably will have something like set name, get name, set age, get the age, how tall, set height, or something like that. So basically, private are your variables pertaining to that object. Public are your functions pertaining to that object. Okay, behaviors. So let me go ahead and do a quick example. So I'm going to go ahead and create a very simple student class. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click header files, add new item. And because this is the header files folder, the header files is always the file extension .h. And my class is called student. So there's student.h. That's just a header file. Now if you go back to my notes, you usually end up with 3 files. The header files for the class, the source file for the class, and then your main. So I'm going to go back into source files, right click it, add new item. This is a C++ because the source file is always CPP. And I'm going to name this student as well so that I know that this CPP file is for this header file. And then I have main CPP, which is where my int main is going to be, where I make use of the class. So let me go ahead and just make a quick class called student, and I'm going to make it very simple. What I'm going to do is this class is only going to have one attribute, 2 actually. I'm going to have string first and string last. So the only thing this class can do at this point is contain the student's first name and last name. And notice string is now, there's an error underneath it. It's only because I need the string library in order to use string. Oh, and I also need the standard namespace. There you go. So under public, let me say I'm going to go ahead and do, why not do a void print name? So I can print the student's name out. I can do set name. Excuse me. So for now, I'll just go ahead and just do those 2 functions. So a very simple class. So just to give you the syntax, the header file contains only the declarations, if you will. So this class has 2 variables, 2 functions. So notice these functions are not defined, they're just being declared. So these are function prototypes. Nothing is being defined at this point. So that's what the header file contains, and that's what I meant when I say it's the blueprint. So it's just a blueprint at this point for the class student. So the class student is going to have 2 functions that are public, 2 attributes that are private. Notice the syntax is the keyword class followed by the class name, open brace, accessor specifier. These are not semicolons, these are colons. And then we have my functions, my variables, just like you've written variables and functions before. Close the brace, and then notice my semicolon. Do not forget the semicolon. So that's just the header file. Now we actually have to define these 2 functions. The 2 functions gets defined in the source file. So that actually is the student.cpp file. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the student.cpp file. Now in order for me to connect the student CPP to student.h to indicate to the computer that these are actually parts of the same class, first thing I'm going to have to do is actually include my student.h file. Excuse the spelling here. Oops. Now student CPP is aware that there is a student.age that contains these two functions for me in my student CPP to define. To tell the computer that these two functions are part of the class called student, in order to define these two functions, I'm going to have to tell the computer that these two functions are part of a class called student. So the syntax for defining the functions will be a little bit different to what you might have been used to when you were writing functions without classes. Right? So how do you do the function definitions? It's the type of the, so this is a void function called print name. Between the type and then the function name, what you need to do is insert the class that it belongs to, which in my case, my class is called student. And then you just need 2 colons. So it's void student : print name. And I'm ready to define this function. And again, that's only for the computer to understand that this is the function definition for the function print name in the class called student. Okay? And this is, again, information hiding. Someone who's using your class just needs to look at the header file. They don't really need to look at the CPP file, so they don't have to look at the definitions. It's information hiding because you're actually allowing the user to use your class without having to know what's happening in the functions. They just need to know how to use the functions. Right, anyways, so for print name, all I'm going to do is cout. So notice my 2 variables, first, last. So I'm just going to cout first, with a space, and then cout last, and line. So as soon as you have a variable as part of a class, any member of that class has access to that variable without having to declare it. So I've declared first and last in here, so both these functions have direct access to those 2 variables without having to declare it. Right, so notice my cout has an error. That's only because I don't have IOStream here, so I'm going to go ahead and add that. I should get rid of it. Right. Now set name. Now let's assume the user has told us their name. We need to be able to set their name to the variable first and to the variable last. And because these 2 variables are private, the only way to access them is via this public function, set name. And notice 2 parameters are being passed to set name. We don't know what those 2 parameters, what values those 2 parameters have in them, but we know that they have the names in them. So this is where I will go ahead and set first to F and last to F. Whoops. So what's going to happen is outside of this class, when we're using this class, we will pass the first and last name of a person, in our case a student, to this function. And then those 2 outside data will be set to the inside internal class data, first and last, so that we can go ahead and save that information to later print it out. This is the class. Very simple. Class called student has 2 attributes, 2 functions. Function is defined in student CPP. Print name just prints first and last. Sets name allows us to take an outside data and set it to first last. But this doesn't mean the program actually runs. We haven't really written a program yet. This is just a class. Where do we write the program? We write it in main.cpp. This is where we create our project using the class student. So let's go ahead and just show you how that would be done. First, of course, I'm going to have to tell main that there is a student class by including it. And then I, of course, need my usual libraries. Right, so here's my int main. Let me go ahead and add my return 0. Let me go ahead and add my system false. How do I make use of the class student? Well, the class student exists now, right? Because we just went over it. In int main, the student is now considered almost like a data type. I could create as many student data types as I want. So student, the word student for my class name, can be considered almost as if it's a data type, like string or int is. So in main, I just have to go ahead and create an object. So this is referred to as an object. So in my case, I've created an object called 1 the data type of that object is student. So it's a object 1 of class student. Now that I have this object, and you can name an object whatever you want as long as you follow the rules. So again, you cannot start with a number, it can't be 2 separate words, and you can't have special characters. So here I have an object called 1 of the student class. And the reason why int main knows that there's a student class is because I've included it up here. Notice the difference in including a library that's part of the system and including a header file that you wrote yourself. So in this case, we use the brackets. In this case, we use quotation marks. Now, this object in int main, this, of course, int main is outside of the student class, can access anything that's public in the student class. So it can access print name, it can access set name by using this object. In order to access those, I use the object name that I've just created and the dot operator. The dot operator is basically the period on your keyboard. So I'm going to go ahead and set name. So notice what I'm doing. I am passing from int main locally, I have the name John Smith. I'm passing locally that information from locally int main to the function set name of the student class through the object 1. So what's happening is the external data John Smith is being passed into the class to be encapsulated and saved in the variable first and the variable last in the class. Then all I have to do is use my object and call print name. And as you probably already noticed, invoking the function print name using my object called 1 is basically just going to print out what's in variable first and what's in variable last with a space in between the two. And of course, from set name, we've set the word John to first, and we've set the word Smith to last. So this is going to print out John Smith. Now, if I had not set the name and I do a print name, I'm actually going to end up with an error, because if I did not set, this is going to try to print a variable called first with no data in it and a variable called last with no data in it. So I actually need to set some data to those variables first before I actually print. So running this, you'll just see it on the screen, John Smith. So you'll notice here's the running version of this program, John Smith. Press any continue is the system pause. Very simple. I had to simplify this just to explain the filing system, but obviously we wouldn't create a class for something as simple as setting first name, last name, and printing it out. Classes are going to actually very, very complex, and it contains a lot of attributes and functions, which makes working with main and calling functions and using it much simpler. At this point, this is just a very simple example. So once again, classes end up with you end up with a multiple file system. The class has a header file and the implementation file, which is a CPP file. The syntax is the keyword class followed by whatever you give the class name, open brace, close semicolon, and then all of your attributes under the private accessor specifier, all of your functions under the public accessor specifier. In the class implementation file, you define the functions. Any functions that you have in here, whether it was in private or public, will need to be defined. And they get defined in your implementation file, which is a CPP file. Before you define them, there's a little bit of a syntax difference to defining a function usually and defining a function within a class. You have to indicate that this is a function that's part of that class. So all you do is between the void and then the function name, you actually put the class name and colon colon. So you just have to remember that. Void, class name, colon colon, and then the function. If this was a value returning function, it would be the value that's being returned, the data type, class name, colon colon, and then the function name. Okay? And then you just define the function like you would any function. To make use of a class, you need an object of that class in int main. You also need to make sure you include your class to make sure the int main knows that this class exists. And so you create an object of your class. So in this case, this is a specific object of the class student. So when you get into specifics, this is called instance. So one is an instance of the student class, so just one student. I can have many more instances of the student class. In fact, I can even have an array of it if I wanted to. And each one of these will be an instance of the student class containing its own information for set name and print name. Each one will contain its own information. And that's, of course, the benefits of creating objects and classes. All right. Hopefully it didn't confuse you too much, but I wanted to give you a brief overview of what classes are. We're obviously going to do a lot more with classes and do more lectures with classes. We're just starting out. This is week 1, so don't freak out. We're going to be doing this more in the weeks to come. Okay, thank you.